Elestrals just got a pretty large rules update that isn't super impactful at the moment, but let's take a look at it. And because I know you guys don't read cards, because that would explain the card, that'd be too easy, I'll take a moment and read it for you. Two-part effects that activate when you do, and instructions are separated. That give an instruction that equal links can have condition when you do. That instruction previously. Now these are known as compound effects. Like when second effect you do condition can only be met by the first effect, but otherwise the two effects same effects result separately. Field checks were introduced. One rules updated. Effects and field checks, although when you do linked effect no longer. I can't. Okay, let's summarize this video and these texts real quick. Alright, so before we go into this change, because I know you guys didn't read the document because we're TCG players, we don't read our cards, so we don't read. I want to go over why this is being changed, because the why I think is a little bit more important than the change itself to start. This might get a little technical, so I'll try to keep it as simple as possible. But there was a community conversation, mostly led by Disencoder and Siberian, Siberian being one of the two lead judges for Elestrals, and Disencoder, who's a prominent Yu-Gi-Oh! Tuber and Twitch streamer who plays a lot of Elestrals, actually, and really knows how rule interactions work. He has an entire series of him judging calls in Yu-Gi-Oh! He knows what he's talking about. Siberian, being one of the two people that made the rules, know what he's talking about. So two very well-established people were having a very strong argument, I guess you could say, as to why the Nexus Elestrals kind of co-linked abilities work the way they do and how it's confusing. The main concept that was confusing was an Elestral that is no longer properly enchanted was creating a chain link and staying in play. To create that chain link when the rules dictate that normally it shouldn't be. And that's because of an exception in the rules for these co-linked when you do abilities. I have a 1-cost Kinleo in play with fire. I activate its ability for chain link 1. Nothing moves yet until this Nexus resolves. This Nexus resolves and I move the spirit off a Kinleo to another card. There's no longer a chain in play and game states would be checked to see that Kinleo would be under-enchanted here and be destroyed. But the exception to the rule here says that Kinleo is still trying to activate a second part of an ability. So because it's still trying to activate an ability, it stays in play, similar to how when you disenchant Boombat stays in play until its ability is resolved and the chain ends. So now, it's trying to activate an ability. So it's staying in play to add a chain link. But it's now misenchanted, so how is it adding that ability to the chain link? And the exception was basically saying, because it's a when you do effect, the first part triggered, now the second part's still resolving as a part of the first part. So the source is the ability, but the source of the ability is the Elestral, so you could still negate the second part, even though it's got very confusing. I'm not going to continue to go into that. It basically, the short end of it is, the when you do part is a second ability activating when the Elestral is misenchanted or underenchanted, states that either it shouldn't be in play or have an ability to activate in the first place to start the when you do part of their ability. And that's confusing, and it was an exception in the rules, and the reason that it was there was because if you look at the history of Elestrals, we've gone to, I think, 3 major rules changes since I started playing way back when, that each time made the game better. And this exception was there to make sure that the Nexus Elestrals still functioned the way that they functioned before the most current official rule setup. So it was an exception. And that exception confused people, and mechanically when you look at the Elestrals rules, it made no sense that it was happening. And some of the arguments for some other things that are happening, I do want to briefly go into this, is a little bit of Yu-Gi-Oh! Braining and Magic braining when we need to be Elestral braining the mechanics. So for example, of a Yu-Gi-Oh! Brain mechanic, Poison Tipped Arrow, when that activates in, let's say, a main phase on a cast, when you get to the end phase in Yu-Gi-Oh!, it would just happen. But in Elestrals, the end phase becomes a chain link that you can respond to, which is very Magic Brain, where, you know, every effect has to hit the stack, even if it was triggered in an earlier step, it still happens. So part of the arguments that we have to look at this is using an Elestrals brain. Elestrals is its own unique card game. It has its own unique rules. You can't really equate Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Magic rules to Elestrals. You really do have to look at the Elestrals rules. And in the Elestrals brain, in the Elestrals rules, that exception didn't make sense. I just want to put that there. So now let's go into mechanically, what does this do for the game? So in set 1, we have 5 Nexus Elestrals that this affects. Maybe more. I'm not sure about Griff use, and I gotta double check that. But at least these 5 Elestrals are called the Nexus Elestrals for set 1. It's a cycle 1 of each element, and they all do Nexus 2 of their element. When you do something else. So the old rules said that I could Nexus away from them, and they would still trigger, do their shenanigans, even if they were underchanted, misenchanted between chains, and then they'd be sent to the underworld after the second chain. Now, if I say play Kinleo, Nexus 1 fire away from it, it will die, and it won't be able to trigger its second ability because it's no longer properly enchanted. If it is, say, enchanted with 1 earth and 1 fire, and you Nexus the fire away from it, it won't die, but it won't activate its ability because now it's misenchanted after the resolution of the first effect. The when you do effect will not trigger. So to use Kinleo and Nexus away from it, you'll have to basically have 2 fire on it now. Nexus away from it, it still has a fire. Second ability will trigger. It pops. It's really not that big of a change. I think Kinleo is the only relevant example where sometimes people use Kinleo like a boom bat, where you disenchant away from it and pop something in a desperate situation, and use that spirit on Celestial and then attack or something. So for set 1, really no major implications here. It just cleans up, again, as I mentioned, the Celestial's brain mechanics. Now, this is the important tidbit. It just destroyed a card that doesn't exist yet. This rule change just absolutely nerfed a card that doesn't see play yet because it doesn't exist, and that's Panzer from Frostfall. So what do I mean by that? Panzer, the 3/3, when you Nexus 2 Earth from it, you can enchant 1 Earth from your Underworld to Panzer. So what you used to be able to do with the old rule set is you could move the Earth from Panzer after you cast it to another card. Its effect will still trigger the when you do part to enchant itself from the Underworld, and then game state check stays in play. You can't do that anymore. If you play Panzer, Nexus is 1 Earth away from it. Before the when you do effect triggers, it will be destroyed and not trigger. RIP Panzer, you couldn't even make it to, or you got nerfed. I'm telling you, Panzer would have been insane. It's a very strong card, if not the strongest card that was spoiled already for Frostfall. One of the strongest cards potentially in the set, because that ability would have been crazy. I know it might sound like, oh, you're just adding 1 spirit from Underworld. It would be recovery on a defensive body. You could repeat it every turn, and you could Nexus away from it, allowing you to do Nexus triggers on like Clovies or set up other cards, pump up your Tectauruses, bring Panzer back with a Gigaflora, play Tectaurus, pump everything. It could have been really cool. And it got shot in the leg. It's still a good card. It's just not like top tier anymore. And it never got a chance to run because this rule change. Which again, the rule change is good. I do agree with the rule change. I just feel like I don't know how I feel actually. I hope something here helped you understand the rule change, but basically not much changes. It's pretty important to understand this concept because we've been telling people like, oh yeah, you could just Nexus away from it, it still works. Not the case anymore, and that is pretty relevant. I know people were thinking like, oh, this is going to be the Spark It nerf. They're going to do something to Spark It and Nexus, yada yada. This was never intended to be interactive with Spark It. People just heard Nexus. Spark It Nexus turn 1 with Zeus was really, really like, it's a boogeyman. Like, it is good, but it's not super consistent right now. It doesn't mean Spark It's a bad card. It's just people were expecting this to do something to Spark It turn 1, and it doesn't. And it was never intended to. It was a completely separate conversation. People just heard Thunder, or rather, they didn't hear Thunder. They heard Nexus, which means Thunder Nexus, which means Spark It, which means they're going to change Spark It. Woo! That didn't happen. For reasons. So, yeah. That's where I'm going to leave this video. I went a little bit longer and ranty than I wanted to be, but I think it's important to go over it all, and I'll see you guys in the next video. You guys have a great one. Peace.